Oh, anyway, what I was gonna say about Mr. House from Fallout New Vegas, right? Okay, so we're all Marxists here, right? I mean, I imagine at least a good number of us are. So in the Marxist historical materialist framework, the idea is that certain modes of production follow from previous ones, right? So feudalism leads into mercantile capitalism, leads into laissez-faire capitalism, which is what we currently exist in, which then leads into socialism, God willing, right? Um, and we do have media. Okay, so we have two types of media that I'm familiar with, right? So it is my belief, and I do believe this, that generally speaking, the historical path tends to follow that model between nations and time periods. So we've seen many pieces of media where the advent of laissez-faire capitalism is seen as a development upon the previous model of feudalism or mercantile capitalism. A good example of this would be Avatar: The Last Airbender, where trade between nations, the ability for individuals to trade, and general, like, Enlightenment era liberal reformism is seen as, like, the good step forward from what the Four Kingdoms had before, which was largely feudalism, right? So in that context, capitalist development, is being framed it's sort of subliminally. They don't talk about capitalism really, but it's the liberal, reform that comes with it. It's kind of a positive. And then you have stuff like BioShock, where you have the consequences of capitalism running up against their wall. You have it being framed in a negative light as the material mode of progression moves past the point where capitalism is a viable way of organizing human beings. But what's interesting is that I don't think I've ever seen a piece of media that really developed the Mr. House dynamic. Because you could argue that Mr. House in Fallout New Vegas represents the advent of capitalism in a system where it is superior to what came before. That Mr. House, even if capitalism is flawed, and it certainly is, even in the context of the game, who's Mr. House to those of us who aren't nerds? He's basically like a 250-year-old wheeling and dealing Vegas capitalist who has dreams of rebuilding civilization after it ended in nuclear hellfire. He is very smart and very talented and very ambitious, but he is also arrogant and, well, a ruthless capitalist, so not the most ethical guy. But the interesting thing is, in the context of the Fallout universe, Mr. House is objectively better than the total absence of rule, right? Like, New Vegas is better than the Wasteland. I think most people would agree, Even if there are problems with New Vegas, and there are, generally speaking, it allows the provision of food and water, and that's more than you get in most of what's left of America. Like, there's a slightly higher basic level of, subsistence, provision. Isn't the NCR somewhat better? I'm just saying Mr. House relative to the rest. And by the way, the NCR is capitalist too. Anyway, don't you think it would be interesting, some kind of RPG or like story-based game in which Mr. House or the Mr. House type character is the good guy in a historical materialist sense, but the bad guy from your ethical framework. So you have to recognize, in the context of the universe that the game takes place in, the ruthless capitalism that they represent is preferable to the feudalism or whatever came before. It is an improvement. It represents a development of the system, but it's still wrong. See, normally in media, the advent of capitalism is implicitly framed as a good thing, uncritically, or the overextension of capitalism is framed as a bad thing explicitly, a la BioShock, right? But rarely is capitalism criticized, even in the period of time when it's useful, right? Because wouldn't that be more pointed? Laying a criticism against the underlying mechanisms, even at a time where it is an improvement, where you can argue, like, yeah, this is better than what came before, but then the criticisms are more salient because you're not just waiting for it to fall to criticize. When do we criticize Rapture? in BioShock after it falls, right? Not before. I want to see Rapture criticized back when it was the apex of technology and culture of its time, right? It's not enough to simply criticize capitalism retroactively. You have to observe the material contradictions before they result in the destruction of the system. That's what Marx did. Marx was criticizing capitalism back when capitalism was just getting its wings. I mean, Marx was writing his criticisms in the 19th century, you know. Capitalism was still, you know, producing market advances in, you know, production and efficiency for all of its problems, and Marx criticized it, you know, validly so, I think. Does this make any sense? Do you understand what I mean? Like the value of constructing a criticism of capitalism in a context wherein it's still the preferable mode of social organization? I think that could be really cool, you know? And I think Mr. House kind of occupies that space, potentially, because it's like an RPG, so you, like, choose who you side with, and also Mr. House is so cartoonishly arrogant that it, you know, it kind of undercuts the ideology. He's more of a, you know, cult of personality himself than he is, like, a representation of capitalism broadly, because the NCR is also capitalist, so he's not the only, like, capitalist game in town. But I think there could be some value to that, you know? Imagine a you know, a game or an RPG or something set in what would be a rough equivalent of the 19th or 18th centuries, wherein you see, like, the exploitation of the capitalist beginning to take shape, and you're thinking, like, okay, well, this is preferable to feudalism, but, you know, like, where is this going? And then, like, the criticisms mount there from the perspective Marx would have had when he saw capitalism growing, you know, as opposed to what we see, which is capitalism already being the global hegemony, and already reaching a kind of, at least, cultural decline. Okay, that's all. That's all I had to say. Hello, everyone. Hi, hey.